Ask anyone what the most feminine shoe in the world is, and you'll get the same answer: the high heel. Now ask who invented it. Almost nobody knows. Which is strange, because the answer isn't a mystery at all. It starts with a soldier, 10th century. A Persian archer stands up in his stirrups, full gallop. He draws his bow. If his foot slips now, he's dead. So someone solves it. A raised heel, locks the foot in place, keeps him standing while the horse thunders beneath him. It's not fashion, it's survival equipment. That small solution, on a battlefield most people have never heard of, is the ancestor of the high heel. The same shoe now sold as the definition of femininity. Here's what almost nobody realizes. This shoe was built by men, for men, and it stayed that way for longer than it's ever belonged to women. There's a story you've probably heard about how that changed. A queen, a wedding, a pair of heels worn to look taller. It's a good story. It's also almost certainly false. To understand this shoe, you have to understand the horse first. Specifically, what it's like to ride one at full speed while trying to kill someone. The Persian cavalry of the 10th century built their entire way of war around this. Mounted archers, riding fast, standing up in the saddle to fire. It sounds simple. It isn't. When a rider stands in the stirrups at a gallop, the foot naturally slides forward. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that half second, balance disappears. Lose your footing at that speed, and you're not just missing your shot. You're falling off a moving horse into a battlefield. So somebody solved it. We don't know his name. We don't know exactly when, but somewhere in the Persian Empire, a cobbler, or a soldier, or maybe just someone tired of nearly dying, added height to the back of the boot. A raised heel. Just enough to catch against the stirrup. Lock the foot in place. Suddenly, a rider could stand, draw, fire, without his foot sliding an inch. This wasn't decoration. This was engineering. And we're not guessing about this. There's a bowl, excavated from a Samanid-era site in Nishapur, showing a mounted soldier in exactly this kind of boot. Another sits today at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, a 10th century Persian bowl, decorated with a horse and rider, clearly wearing a heeled riding boot. This isn't folklore. This is physical evidence. Sitting in museum collections, right now. A shoe built for one specific life or death purpose. But purposes have a way of not staying put. Because a shoe built to keep a man alive on horseback was about to become something else entirely. A way to prove he never had to work at all. Here's what happened next. The soldiers went home, but the boots stayed on. And that's strange, if you think about it. Why would you keep wearing battlefield gear once the battle's over? The answer has nothing to do with comfort. In Persia, owning a horse was already a mark of wealth. Not everyone could feed one. Not everyone could stable one. A horse meant land, money, standing. So a boot built for horseback carried that meaning with it. Even off the horse, even walking through a market or standing in a courtroom, the heel said something before you said a word. It said, "I ride," which meant, I don't have to walk. And by the early 1600s, this had gone somewhere almost absurd. Persian noblemen were wearing heels up to 5 inches tall. 5 inches, on streets made of dirt and stone. Streets that were, frankly, filthy. Which meant walking in these things was genuinely difficult. So the wealthiest simply didn't. Servants carried them, literally carried them, through the mud. So the fine leather and paint on those heels never touched the ground at all. Think about what that actually means. A shoe so impractical, it required another human being just to keep it clean. That wasn't a flaw. That was the entire point. Because true luxury has never been about usefulness. It's about showing the world you don't need to be useful. This idea, this shoe, was about to leave Persia entirely. Not carried by an army this time, carried by a diplomat. The man who carried it west was Shah Abbas I, ruler of Persia, commander of the largest cavalry force in the world at the time. In the early 1600s, Abbas did something unusual for a Persian monarch. He looked toward Europe, not as an enemy, as a potential ally. He sent diplomats, trade missions, gifts, an entire campaign to build relationships with European courts, and every time a Persian envoy arrived, he arrived in those boots, heeled, polished, unmistakably foreign. European nobility had never seen anything quite like them. Remember, this was still an era when men's fashion was built around the leg. Tights, breeches, fitted hose. A man's calves, his stance, his posture on a horse. These were things other men actually looked at, actually judged. So when Persian heels showed up, lengthening the leg, changing the way a man stood, adding an inch or two of unmistakable presence, European aristocrats didn't see a foreign oddity. They saw something they wanted. There's a pattern here, worth noticing. According to Elizabeth Semmelhack, the leading historian on footwear at the Bata Shoe Museum, this wasn't really about Persia at all. It was about imitation. One elite watching another elite and copying what looked like power. The same way any trend spreads, really. Somebody with status does something. Somebody else with status doesn't want to be left behind. By the late 1500s and into the 1600s, heeled boots were spreading through European courts, from France to Germany to Russia. Not because anyone understood the stirrup problem they were originally built to solve. Most of these men never rode into battle at all. They just understood one thing perfectly. This is what powerful men wear. And in every court in Europe, that message never once needed translating. But one king wasn't content to simply wear the trend. He wanted to own it, legally, completely. He was about to turn a shoe into a law. If one man turned this shoe into a weapon, it was Louis XIV, King of France, the Sun King, and, worth mentioning, a man standing at roughly 5'4", in a court built entirely around the appearance of power. So Louis did what powerful, short kings have always done. He found a way to stand taller, literally. His heels reached 4 inches, sometimes more, but height wasn't even the clever part. The color was. Louis had his heels lacquered, in a deep, saturated red. And red, in 17th century France, wasn't just a color, it was an expense. The dye came from crushed kermes insects, imported, painstaking to produce, and brutally expensive. A red heel didn't just say, "I have money." It said, "I have so much money, I can afford to dye something people are going to step in mud with." Then, in 1670, Louis went further than fashion. He issued an edict, an actual royal decree, stating that red heels could only be worn by members of his own court, his inner circle, the people closest to him. Think about what that means. This wasn't a trend anymore. It was law. Walk into the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and you didn't need an introduction. You didn't need to ask who mattered. You looked down, at the floor, at people's feet, and the red heels told you everything. Who belonged, who didn't, who was close to the king, and who was just visiting. Status made visible, from clear across the room. No conversation required. This is worth sitting with for a second. A monarch took a piece of footwear and turned it into a legal, visible hierarchy. That's not something people usually do with shoes. For decades after this, the heel belonged entirely to men, entirely to power, entirely to Versailles. Full stop. Which raises a real question. If this was so completely a man's symbol, so tied to kings and courts and cavalry, how did the story end up crediting a woman with inventing it? Here's the story, the one you've probably heard, if you've ever read anything about the history of heels. 1533, Florence. A 14-year-old girl is about to be married off. Her name is Catherine de Medici, and the match is enormous. She's marrying Henri, the second son of the King of France. A political alliance, dressed up as a wedding. But Catherine has a problem. She's small, barely 5 feet tall, by some accounts even less, and she's about to stand in front of the entire French court, next to a groom who towers over her, in a room full of nobles, sizing her up, judging whether this foreign girl is really worth the alliance. So, the story goes, Catherine does something clever. Instead of the flat shoes, or the clunky wooden chopines women sometimes wore, she commissions something new. Heels. Elegant ones. Tall enough to add real height. Refined enough not to look absurd. She walks down the aisle, not as a small girl overwhelmed by her surroundings, but standing taller, closer to eye level with the room, commanding, even. And the story says, the court noticed. Other women noticed. If a future queen could use heels to command a room, why couldn't they? And just like that, a shoe that had belonged entirely to men, to soldiers, to kings, crosses over. One clever bride, one wedding, one moment of quiet reinvention. It's a wonderful story. It's specific. It's got a name, a date, a motive that makes total sense. A young girl using fashion to seize a little bit of power in a room built to overwhelm her. It's the kind of story that gets repeated in article after article, documentary after documentary, for nearly 500 years. There's just one problem. That story, the one you just heard, has no source. Not a weak source. Not a disputed source. None. A costume historian went looking for it directly. Not casually. Not just skimming old books. An actual, dedicated search for any contemporary account. Any letter. Any court record. Any description written by someone who was actually there in 1533, mentioning Catherine's shoes at all. Nothing turned up. So they went further. They reached out directly to Elizabeth Semmelhack, senior curator at the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto, the leading historian on the subject of footwear in the world. Someone who has spent decades researching this exact question. And her answer was clear. She has never been able to find a single historical reference supporting this story. Not one. Let that sit for a second. The most repeated origin story in the entire history of the high heel doesn't appear in a single document from the actual year it supposedly happened. No letter describes it. No court chronicler mentions it. No portrait from that period shows it. It shows up later, much later. Retold and retold and retold, until it hardened into something that felt true, simply because everyone had heard it before. That's not history. That's folklore, wearing the coat of history. And here's the uncomfortable part. Stories like this survive, not because they're accurate, but because they're satisfying. A clever girl, a room full of doubters, one small act of reinvention. It's a great story. It's just not what happened. So if it wasn't a queen, at a wedding, reinventing a shoe in a single afternoon, then what actually put heels on women? The real answer is a lot less cinematic. There's no single wedding, no single woman, no single afternoon where everything changed. Instead, it happened the way most real history happens. Slowly, messily, across decades. By the mid-1600s, something was shifting in fashionable European society. Women of status, women with money, influence, ambition, started adopting traits the culture had reserved for men. Not quietly either. They cut their hair short. They smoked pipes, in public, at a time when that alone raised eyebrows. They wore epaulettes, military details, structured shoulders, little pieces of a soldier's uniform, stitched into a woman's wardrobe. According to Elizabeth Semmelhack, this wasn't random. It was strategic. Every visible marker of masculinity these women adopted was really a marker of power. Because in this world, power looked male. Authority looked male. Presence in a room looked male. So if you wanted to be taken seriously, if you wanted people to actually notice you, you borrowed the visual language that already meant something. And heels were part of that language. They'd spent decades meaning exactly one thing: status, command, a person worth paying attention to. So women reached for them, not to seduce, not to appear delicate, the opposite actually, to appear formidable. This wasn't a single decision. It was hundreds of small decisions, made independently, by women who'd noticed the same thing, that the clothes coded as powerful, and the clothes coded as feminine, were not the same clothes at all. And for a while, that overlap actually worked. Heels stopped being exclusively male. They became, for one brief window in history, something almost anyone with status could wear. Men wore them, women wore them, the line blurred, but that window wouldn't stay open. One idea was coming that would slam it shut completely. And when it did, it wouldn't just take heels away from men, it would hand women the blame for wanting them in the first place. The idea that ended it wasn't about shoes at all. It was about reason. By the early 1700s, a new way of thinking was spreading across Europe. The Enlightenment. Philosophers, scientists. A growing obsession with rationality, logic, evidence. Stripping away tradition, superstition, and anything that couldn't justify itself. And fashion, especially the kind Louis XIV had built his entire court around, suddenly looked ridiculous. Powdered wigs, silk stockings, 4-inch red heels that required a servant just to keep clean. None of it served a purpose. None of it could be defended with logic. So, slowly, then quickly, men started walking away from it. Within a single generation, heels went from the defining mark of a powerful man to something faintly embarrassing, impractical, frivolous, the exact word that mattered most. Because here's the thing about frivolous. It needed somewhere to go. The Enlightenment didn't eliminate the idea of irrationality. It just needed a new home for it. And thinkers of the era found one. Women. The same era that celebrated reason also built an entire framework, insisting women were, by nature, less rational than men, more emotional, more decorative, less suited for public life, for politics, for serious thought. And once that idea took hold, heels became evidence for it, not the cause, the evidence. Look, they said, women wear these impractical, illogical shoes. See, it confirms exactly what we already believed. It's a strange kind of trap, the very quality that once made heels a symbol of power. Their uselessness, their extravagance, became the same quality used to justify keeping an entire half of society out of power altogether. Men simply took off their heels and walked into rooms as serious, rational beings. Women were left holding the thing that had briefly meant the same for them, and watched its meaning get twisted into a punchline. For nearly a century after this, heels barely register in fashion at all, too tainted by frivolity, too tied to a court everyone wanted to forget. But an idea this useful, this good at signaling status, doesn't stay buried forever. When heels came back, they'd be rebuilt into something Louis XIV would never recognize. It took nearly 100 years for the heel to fully recover. Through most of the 1800s, it crept back slowly. Modest heights, practical shapes, nothing like the towering red heels of Versailles. By the time it returned in force, the world around it had changed completely. This time, it wasn't returning as a man's shoe at all. It belonged, fully and exclusively, to women. But the version that finally defined the modern era didn't arrive until the middle of the 20th century, and it needed an engineering breakthrough to exist at all. For centuries, a tall, thin heel had one major problem. It broke. Wood, stacked leather. None of it could support real body weight, on a point that thin without snapping. The solution came from a French designer named Roger Vivier, working alongside the house of Christian Dior. Vivier had an idea. Instead of wood or leather, build the heel around a thin rod of steel, hidden inside, invisible, doing all the structural work that the outer shape alone never could. Suddenly, a heel could be impossibly thin, dramatically tall, and still hold a person upright. This was the birth of the stiletto, named, fittingly, after a thin, sharp blade. Now, here's a detail worth pausing on. Vivier is the name most remembered. But he wasn't the only one. Other designers, working in the same era, made their own claims to the breakthrough. Andrea Perugia, Salvatore Ferragamo, each with their own version, their own patents, their own story about who really solved the problem first. Sound familiar? It's the same argument that's followed this shoe since a Persian cobbler first added height to a boot, with nobody bothering to write down his name. Credit, once again, refusing to settle cleanly. What isn't disputed is how fast the stiletto became a cultural symbol. Salvatore Ferragamo, already known as shoemaker to the stars, put his designs on some of the most photographed women alive. Marilyn Monroe, Ava Gardner, Sophia Loren. Every camera flash cemented the same idea a little further. This shoe meant glamour, sensuality, modern femininity, distilled into a single sharp point. The same object that once meant, "I ride into battle," now meant something the culture had never once associated with heels before: desire. So, here's where that leaves us. A shoe invented by a soldier, whose name nobody wrote down, built to solve one problem: staying on a horse long enough to survive. For 700 years, give or take, it belonged almost entirely to men. Soldiers, diplomats, kings who turned it into law. Women didn't invent it, didn't choose it, didn't even wear it in any real numbers until men had already worn it for centuries. And when women finally did claim it, that wasn't an act of vanity either. It was women reaching for a symbol that already meant power, in a world that gave them very few symbols to reach for. Then rationality became fashionable, and men simply walked away from it, left the heel behind, along with the label of frivolous, which didn't disappear. It just found a new person to describe. None of this was really about shoes. It was about who got to be taken seriously, and who got left holding whatever was left over. Today, the story isn't quite finished either. Cowboy boots still carry a version of that original Persian heel, for the same reason it was invented in the first place: staying secure in a stirrup. Glam rock stars strapped on heels in the 1970s and dared anyone to call it strange. And on runways today, menswear designers keep quietly bringing heels back, as if some small part of fashion remembers where this all started. The most feminine shoe in the world spent longer as a man's shoe than it's ever spent as anything else. Nobody voted on that. Nobody chose it, either time. History just kept handing this shoe to whoever needed to prove something about power, and every few centuries, it changes hands again. If a piece of cloth around a man's neck could carry this much unspoken history, imagine what's hiding in the shoes on your own feet.